All right, we're set. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another Educator Collaborative gathering. I believe it's the 10th year that we're doing this, the 10th one. It's so exciting. And I'm pleased and honored to have with us today Sheetal, Sheth, author, actor, activist, and friend. And we are so excited to be here today. I'm JoEllen McCarthy, Educator Collaborative K-5 book ambassador, lifelong learner, and educator. And Sheetal, welcome. Thank you for
Thank
joining us.
you. No, thank you for having me. I love that you 10 years. I mean, doing this kind of work is so important. It's funny because you feel like that's such a long time. And then you're like, how did this not exist even before that? Because 10 years that's just 2011,
Yeah, I think I might be off on the number of years. It might be the 10th because it's a biannual event, so it's the 10th
Got it.
one. So, but it's still really something very exciting to celebrate. So, and I know
Absolutely. Absolutely.
it's a wonderful opportunity for free PD in your PJs and a wonderful
Yes.
opportunity to connect with authors and other educators and just a day filled with PD love. So I'm so happy to be a part of it and thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely.
So Sheetal and I go way back. We are both friends and educator activists and people who love the fact that picture books can be our co-teachers. And I always say that the books as co-teachers are the most powerful resource that we have. And bringing someone into the classroom like Sheetal, when we're able to do such a thing, is an amazing way for kids to really have a huge connection to the books and the stories behind the books. So today we're going to talk about using books as co-teachers to connect community, character, and conscience. And we are super excited because we want to talk a little bit about the ways we nurture community, character, and conscience through books. So maybe Sheetal, you want to share a little? I know we have Always Anjali and Bravo Anjali as two favorite books to talk about, but just in terms of the powerful work that you do as an author, as an activist, and the ways that you
Yes.
bring this to the table for classrooms.
Yeah, my entry point is, I started writing children's books because I just didn't see the representation that I felt I wanted to see. I found that the stuff that was out there at the time, and we've come a little bit better, but we still have a lot of work to do, was very much centered around stories that, again, would be sometimes culturally insensitive, inaccurate, or just plain wrong. And or they were around holidays and extraordinary events, and I just felt like, why can't we just be enjoying our life and walking our dogs and washing our hands and having breakfast with our family like everybody else does? And that was really what I felt was something that was missing, especially books with kids of color. And then, on top of that, it was also about, I truly believe kids are never too young to talk to about anything. And so, obviously, with the appropriate language, I feel like we got to have these conversations early. The earlier, the better. And there's things we can do for our kids, even when they're babies, in terms of what we put in front of them, what we're exposing them to, that are very much in our control and can make a big difference in the way that they look at the world.
Absolutely. And I think it's important too, what you said about, using books so that kids can actually see joyful stories, everyday lives, experiencing and honoring the lived experiences of a variety, an array of children from various backgrounds. And one thing you'll notice that Sheetal and I say very often is that we talk about the term inclusive books versus diverse, because
Yes.
it's really sometimes problematic to say that a book is diverse and then you're othering. And that's another whole layer of this conversation. So as we said, we really wanted to focus on connecting this idea of nurturing community and looking closely at character and conscience, because we have an opportunity to read and be more aware and really to check our individual biases, our the systems and issues in play in our world. And so if we're focusing on how we read and how the reader writes the story, books bring us the opportunity to have these conversations.
Yes, and I think just to elaborate a little bit more on you talking about, because the word diverse for me just, again, feels just, it's like it gives me a cringe, whenever I hear that. And it's also about, what I'd like to say is that it's centering stories of people that have always been in their own lives. Like, we are the hero of our stories. It's just that the rest of the world would never give us the opportunity to be centered. And so that's really what it is. It's about centering stories that are just traditionally on the margins, but we are no less than, or we are no less the hero of our stories than anybody else.
That's so well said and so beautiful. And I think that that's so important. And so
Yeah.
today, as we spend some time sharing our thinking around this, we want you to reflect with us. If there's something that resonates with you, feel free to use the Educator Collaborative's hashtag for the gathering today, which is just hashtag the Ed Collab gathering. And certainly you can connect with Sheetal or myself after and share your thoughts, because we'd love to hear from you. Because I know myself, I'm always learning and growing, and I learn from people like Sheetal and the authors that I'm privileged and honored to know and work with, and then the books, because as I say, the books are those co-teachers for stories
Yeah.
and experiences that we can all share together. Those shared stories, I think, is part of what really, really helps to nurture that community. So just thinking about some things that we want to leave you with in terms of ideas and opportunities. We already mentioned, we want to read to be more aware, and then we want to connect literacy to all of these areas. And we really want to focus on the opportunity to explore the ways that, agency and activism and empathy and equity and humanity are all like bound together, just like the spiral in a book. And so when we are focusing on this work and we're thinking about, ways to explore text, we want you to be with us on this journey and focusing on an evolving collection. And you can see that Always Anjali is here prominently displayed on a 5th grade bookshelf. And so it's more important to notice that everything else that's on that bookshelf has been curated by kids. You notice that the reference to Read Woke, and you notice the reference to, thinking about ways we can curate collections with our students so that they can be part of this approach to building stacks and creating text sets, and that, with some support and some guidance to connect the content areas as well as we're thinking about this. We referenced some books to consider and to think about in terms of continuing this conversation. And I have to say, between Cultivating Genius and book clubs, breathing new life into book clubs, there's so many ways to think about this beyond picture books at all levels, to understand the ways that we can give kids an opportunity to think about themes and affirm.
Well, and I don't want to interrupt you, but we have to
please.
talk about your book, Layers of Learning, which is also on there. Because you're not going to say it, but it's a fantastic book that really breaks down how these can be used as resources and tools. So please, guys, get that book, because it's something that I feel like should be one of those things that everybody has, because it has so much great information, and the resources and the tips are just great.
Okay, now I'm going to be embarrassed. I didn't ask yourself to say that.
I know, but because I know you're not going to say it. So
thank you. Okay, so moving on, thinking about that, I think it's the framework and we are continuing to evolve in the way that we look at books, teachers and students, and really being, aware of the fact that our ongoing reflections and self-reflections is what helps us grow. So I want to share some pieces from Anjali in a moment, just because, as we said, we want to leave you with some takeaways and some ideas, and we want you to think about beyond books, but at the same time to have the vision and the opportunity to see through a text and think about how we can transfer across text, like starting with community, right? Community starts with an affirmation of identity and cultural ways of being, and really, really explicitly talking about the ways we are the same and we are different. And I know, Sheetal, you said we wanted to talk a lot about that because that's so essential.
Well, and I think what happens sometimes, because I think obviously teachers and educators and parents have so much on their plates. So they're just looking, everyone wants to do this work. Everyone wants to be more conscious. Everyone wants to be more socially minded with their children and do better. And what often happens is a bit of tokenism, where people will say, oh, I have the Black book, I've got the Indian book, I've got the and I have the things that I feel like tick the boxes, and they feel like, okay, that's a step, and it's a step. But what I would urge people to think about is there's no monolithic community, period. And just like you may have 25 or 50 books centering white characters and all the nuances and layers and experience that they have, we deserve the same. And so don't be afraid to say, if you're presenting 10 books to your class over a semester, they can all be of kids of color. Why not? like for the longest time, we weren't even part of the conversation, because again, it's about what we have in common and then celebrating the differences. And I guarantee you, if their entry point is how do you centering on the characters are feeling in the moments of these books, every child will relate. And so I would just like to dare people to, put books out there that maybe 7 of 10 have women, have girls as the center of them. That's okay. Maybe they can be all people, but maybe they can be all kids of black, all the kids are black. That's okay, because there's so many stories. And so I just want to push this narrative of like, not just token, like picking the 5 books that you think everybody should have, and maybe that's true, but what can we do beyond that? There's so many other stories about these communities that I feel are just as important to be telling. And it also gives a signal to the class, again, that we're not othered. Like, it's not just, oh well, that's what they do. It's like one experience. Again, there's a variety of experiences across the board, and it will show that, again, this community is very similar to yours, because none of us are the same.
Right. And likewise, to celebrate and to be aware of what makes us unique. And that's a beautiful
Mhm.
thing. And that's equally as important. And I think, in this work, oftentimes when teachers are thinking critically about the books that are on their shelves, they have to also say, well, maybe there's time to take some books off and replace
Yes.
new books. So we're going to talk a little
Please,
bit
this
about
idea
that.
of like the classics, I'm just like, oh my gosh, can we just, there's so many things that do it better, wiser, like it's okay. It's okay to just
Exactly.
like say
Exactly.
bye-bye. It's okay.
Exactly. And if we really are being aware of, the harmful representation of some
Yes.
books, and I think that's something that, it's okay to have that conversation. And when you're
Yes.
looking at that book, to talk about that and to talk about the why. So,
Well,
as we,
I think what a really cool thing to do is, I had a teacher friend told me, I love that she did this. She like took some of those classics that were harmful in the portrayals, and she would talk about them with the kids and say, what do you guys think? Let's talk about it. Do you feel like this is appropriate? Do you feel uncomfortable? Why is it? And do you want to keep this in our classroom or not? And let them decide. And so it's a really cool way to get the kids engaged in that critical kind of readership.
absolutely. And I think that's so huge, having kids being part of this conversation. So,
Yeah.
which brings us to one of the things we were talking about is the power of universal stories. And oftentimes with young children, we'll see books that have, animals and as the main characters to address certain topics or issues. And although that's a powerful and wonderful thing, we still want kids and real conversations to evolve around those stories as well. And so I absolutely love Worm Loves Worm. And I know we have Mike Curato as one of the keynote speakers for the gathering this year, which is amazing. But I just wanted to, Sheetal and I wanted to share a
Yeah.
little bit about that, about, the authentic stories with real stories.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a sucker for a good book with animals. I think they're adorable and lovely, and I love them. But there are still more books about animals than there are about kids of color. And there are about like just kids in general. And so there have been studies that have been done that I think, I don't know what the latest statistic is, it's like 60 or 70 some percent of stories center around whether it be animals or fantastical elements or superhero or things that, again, are not doable in your everyday life, and what that does to children. And again, these studies say, it's so interesting that kids, of course they love them, we all love them, we love it, who doesn't love a superhero movie? But at the end of the day, in terms of really connecting and feeling like you see yourself and you see what's possible in your life and what's doable, and giving yourself the agency to be like, oh, that kid did that, I could do that too, because kids don't really see that connection as clearly when it's an animal or when it's something that has a kind of fantastical, magical element to it. And on top of that, what happens with the animal stuff is, some people like this, but it's kind of an easy out by not dealing with color. And again, kids need to see kids of color, and they need to see them in roles that we want to see them in, that we live in the world in, and we need to be centering those stories. And again, as heroes, as agents of love, as humor, and all of these things. And so I just would urge folks to use actual books with actual kids doing things, so that kids can feel like, I can do that too. It would go a long way.
Right. So one of the things that we often say in the classroom, working with kids to think about, it's not about the books, it's about the conversations you have around the book. So
Yeah,
whether there are animals or real people, it's how do we then go beyond the book to
right.
have these powerful stories and conversations, I should say, that were maybe prompted because of a story that made you think in a new way, or maybe helped you affirm a thought you already had, or maybe made you question something about the
Hmm.
world. And that's the most important work that we can do with these texts. So we've talked a little bit about, community and character as a focus, and then thinking about conscience, which we kind of defined as those signals from your mind and heart. And I think Always Anjali is a great place to start in terms of, an entry point to this work. So Sheetal, if you can share a little bit about.
Yes, and it's very much, when I talk about always, oh yes, thank you. When I talk about always Anjali, and when I work with children and we do sessions and readings, I always like to, again, when I talked about earlier, is to talk about the feeling. And so, for example, that slide you just saw where she can't find her name, I always ask people, how do you think she's feeling? And how would you feel if you didn't feel like you were part of a group? And then it becomes a larger conversation of, why is it important for everyone to have their voice heard? Why is it important for everyone to feel like they're included and that they're seen? And that's what this is. This is Anjali not feeling seen. And so that's a great way to make sure people are looking around. Like I always say, look at your circle. Wouldn't you miss out on something if your friend didn't share something about whatever it is you're talking about? And why is it important that every single person gets a chance to share? Because it makes you better, And so that slide is always one thing that I notice with kids. They take a minute because they're like, oh my God, I don't even know what that would feel like for some of them. And many of them do know what it feels like. And then it takes them into that place of, so then what can we do better? How can we make sure that everyone feels included?
And I think that's the key. Like, what can we do better? Because we can
Yes.
all do better. And
Yes.
it brings me to a point in your book, which I think is also equally as powerful, with this page where you see that she's being teased.
Yeah.
And so it's not a joyful example, but I think when we're talking about, reading with a critical lens, for kids to then stop and be able to put a name, or to be aware and to identify, what another child or character is doing, it takes some of the pressure off of, the real situations that we can then say, like, transfer to a book and see in that character, like, well, what would you do differently if you're that character,
Yeah.
or what did you
Well,
notice about.
and in that scene, it was purposeful that it was an adult that heard the whole thing, wasn't that sensitive to anything she was going through, and then gave her a plate that wasn't her name. And that was and then, it goes on with the kids who take it even further. But that was purposeful because we are all guilty of it, including adults. And so many people, including teachers, I think, often will ask, and it happened to me growing up, is there a different name you go by? Is there a nickname you have? And it's like, no, just learn my name.
Right.
And I cannot tell you how, and by the way, even asking that to a child who you would never ask that to any of the other kids because you don't want to take the time to learn the child's name. It's important. Learn the name, take the extra time, show that you care. It makes such a difference. And I cannot tell you how many stories I've heard of kids, even at school visits, to be like, my teacher still can't say my name. And it really leaves a very, it's tough. It's tough on the kid because they don't feel like they matter.
Right. And I think what you said, and there's an article that we put in one of the resource slides that has a wonderful article that Sheetal wrote about what if the bully is an adult. And I think that's an
Hmm.
important conversation. And a book like Anjali helps have that. And so if we're thinking about transferring this, going beyond this one text, although it's powerful and wonderful and we love it and everyone should have it, what are some of the steps that we can take as educators or as parents and families, and thinking about how we can do this work, and and get kids to think a little more deeply. How can we revisit like a critical scene in the example with Anjali, that place where, the adult stopped and said, well, chuckled at, well, here, take this one, it's close enough kind of thing. And getting
Yeah.
kids to be involved in that conversation, to question a specific page, an event, an idea, to then uncover a bigger theme or a bigger life lesson, or maybe look closely at an illustration and think about how the author or the illustrator's choices impacts the reader's interpretations,
Yes,
right?
and it's a great way to hold up, because there's so many pictures in the book that I have purposely put, be like, especially the scene where she is being teased. And I always stop and say, what could these kids have done differently in that moment? What could you have done differently in that moment? Because we look around and I'm like, we can all see a lot of people, and some kids are very astute and they say, why didn't her friend say anything? And I said, that's a great question. And another question to say is, something we're told and we tell our kids all the time is it's okay to be different. We want to be different. So then why does she get made fun of for being different? And so
Right.
those are all questions that we need to have, and then again, in the moments, be like, what could that person have done? What could you have done? What could, there's lots of ways of let's find a new way of handling something like this if it happens.
Yeah, I think that's so important, is it, as I said, and as you said, thinking about ways we can always look to be better. And then how are kids using those experiences both in fiction and also in nonfiction informational texts to think about, what they're learning from a particular stance or opinion of the author and how it then translates to real life. So when you and I were putting some of this together, we were talking about, the importance of student-led discussions and how
Yes.
oftentimes in student-led discussions, it's talking to others is a way of taking action. And that's so important if you think about that. If we have a powerful text, and it could be everyday text, as Vivian Vasquez says, the everyday text of our world, asking kids, what do you think? What would you do? Why do you think that is? What do you agree or disagree with? And sometimes these open-ended questions really helps to do this work, even as simple as, thinking about how, what are you thinking? What are you noticing? What are you
Hmm.
questioning? And can you say more, right? So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, those open-ended questions and getting kids to think about, work where we're really being able to tap into that, critical lens and thinking about voices and feelings and questions like that.
Yes, and I think it's also, again, pushing kids, like you said, can you say more? Pushing them to go beyond that initial, like, sometimes people always say, well, of course, the easy answer of like, well, we shouldn't be bullying. Okay, but let's unpack that a little bit more and take it further. And also, making a point to point out where, like, especially with, and I'll talk about Always on Joy, obviously, because I know the book and I wrote the book, but there are specific moments in there where there are places where you can say, well, where is her family from? And then say, where are all you from? Because again, not othering, everybody's from somewhere. What do you guys do in your family when you have a birthday? What do you guys do at your dinner table? What do you guys like? All of those things, again, just to center the stories and to show again how similar she is. So then why does she get treated this way? And why do you think it's important to get her name right? And why did she want to change her name? How do you think she would be feeling? And why does she end up not changing her name? And isn't it so much cooler that she made a license plate for herself that no one else will have? Because if we were all the same, it would be so boring. All of these things. And and how did she handle Zachary at the end? What happened to her? Why did she handle it that way? And what do you think she's feeling at the end? Do you think it was hard for her to stand up to him at the end? All of those things to, again, unpack it into little moments, which I think are more accessible when it comes to kids. And I think those are the things I always ask the kids, what, not just what's your favorite part of the book, but what image or what part of the book are you thinking about right now? What's that one piece that has stayed with you? And it's always different things. Some of them are like, oh, I love the part where she had a birthday present. But most people, it's always the like the moment of conflict or the moment of resolution. Those are the things, because that's the stuff that they're like wondering how they would handle that situation.
Right. And I think that's where, the nudging and
Yes.
and
Yes.
that's where the support from teachers, and then,
Yes.
even leaning in and listening. This is all about listening to kids and listening to the
Mhm.
conversations, letting kids lead the way and being able to then, oh, so I heard you say, and kind of just, building on those ideas and having an environment where kids are comfortable to share those ideas and to
Yes.
have those
It
discussions.
has to be a safe space.
Right. And so one of the things that you just said, which kind of builds on this idea of, what are some takeaways that how we can do this work, and an entry point, to consider family and family structures. And so I just wanted to point out, 3 books that are in a series actually about families, and they're by Dan Sachs and illustrated by Brooke Smart. And just, in terms of giving a vision for the possibility, like Families Belong is just one text that looks at a variety of families of all different shapes and sizes, and Families Can also celebrates the unique an array of families, and how love comes in all shapes and sizes, and what are the wonderful different things that families can do, from from play to music to everything. And then Families Grow, in the same idea and the same theme, looks at the ways that families do grow in size and shape, and whether it's from surrogacy or from adoption or from a blended family. And I think all of those things are really centering the beauty of families and the different shapes and structures of families. And so kids then can tap into their own lives and their own experiences, and thinking about the unique examples from their own families. And so it's like a safe place. Not that we're saying we need a safe place to start, but it's an important place to start, that we're
Yes.
thinking about this, and that we're talking about these things with this lens of, an array of beauty and love through a variety of families. And oftentimes, I know personally, I've had teachers who are like, well, I don't have to share a book that has, representation with 2 moms, because we don't have anybody in our class that has 2 moms. And it's like, oh, no, that,
Oh my God.
so, thinking about
Yes.
making this important work that happens every day just because.
Yes, exactly. Just because, by the way, we live in a world where these things
Exactly.
exist.
Exactly.
Even if it's not
Exactly.
happening to you. I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I always say, one question I ask kids is, why is it important for you to read books with kids that don't look like you, or experiencing something that you've never experienced? It's, again, pushing kids. When you're recommending books to your children, because all teachers do that, pick books that aren't about, it's important to obviously see your stuff represented, but also more so that you learn other things about other people, to teach kids empathy.
Right. And it's also perspective and point of view, which comes into play,
Yes,
because
yes,
everyone views the world differently. And
yes.
those, experiences are what shapes your view of the world. And therefore, we have to have these conversations, and look with texts as our co-teachers, so that kids have this opportunity. And I think, if we're talking about some takeaways and some ideas, and, family structure is one thing, but the other thing is to, like, just honor everyday experiences. And so all of these books, look at a variety of beautiful stories, and they're
Mhm.
not issue books, because I think that's another problem. Like, if you look, and you can screenshot these as some examples. And again, it's not to say that these are books you have to have, but just giving a vision for what's possible. Like From Archie to Zach is just a sweet story about, 2 boys that, write their letters to each other about how much they care for each other. And it's just, it's not explicitly stated. And I read one review about this book when it first came out, and I thought it was almost, somebody said problematic, that it wasn't explicitly stated, why there was tension. And I'm like, but that's the whole point of a
Yeah.
powerful book, that you can have this conversation of the beauty of, 2 boys that care for each other, and they're writing these little letters back and forth and notes, and like everybody in class was helping the notes be passed, and just, thinking about that. Or the book that was on there,
Yeah.
I Will Dance, which looks at a differently abled person, and based on a true story of a dance troupe that is called, I believe it was called Young Dance. I have to go back and look and see the author is Nancy Bo Flood, and how, a young girl who participated in this dance troupe wanted to be able to dance, and she didn't want to just imagine dance. She didn't want to just experience dance in a different way. She wanted to actually dance. And so giving kids an opportunity to see, a variety of experiences, and honoring those everyday experiences. When Aiden became a brother, Aiden is, struggling with the fact that everybody's calling this new baby and wanting to say, is it a boy or a girl? And Aiden's just like,
Mhm.
it's a baby. Like, I just love the sweetness of that story. And so many great ideas on there.
Well,
And
and I love that. It's all about folding these things in. It's folding in these things that people are like it doesn't, so often people will say to me about all kinds of, it doesn't feel Indian enough. And I'm like, what does that mean to you? Why? Because we're not wearing Indian clothes. We're not celebrating Diwali. We're not like all the things that you're used to seeing. that you have decided makes something something is the whole point. It's about all the other stuff. It's about folding in the stuff that just makes us who we are.
Yep, and honoring those lived experiences, just I think,
Yeah.
we can't say enough. I love the fact that we could go on and on in terms of talking about books, but I think what we have to then do is be reflective and ask,
Mhm.
who or what is on your shelves. Because I think about, Junie B. Jones comes to mind, and I'm sorry, but I feel like there's a whole world beyond Junie B. Jones. So I just put a
Yes.
selection of a variety of wonderful series books like Renee Watson and the new Ryan Hart stories coming out. Kelly Starling Lyons has a great I Can Read book. And when you think about some of these books across the grade levels and across the experiences, like are on the shelves for many of our classrooms, like we need to kind of do a little inventory and audit,
Yeah.
see like
Yes.
what's time to kind of move. And that's something that we have to be aware of. So that's a step that we would suggest that you take, get together with your colleagues, have a little BYOB, bring your own book, and then let's talk about it. What could we use this book for in terms of nurturing community or character or conscience? And if there are problematic issues, maybe we need to think about addressing it.
Let's make space for more. It's time to just I notice that, we now go to the library so much because I have 2 young kids. And I'm just like, oh my God, the libraries are so outdated. And it's hard. I know it's hard, but like everything needs a full cleaning, like a spring cleaning. It's like, we don't need these books so much anymore. And not that you can't have all of them, but there's only space for a few. Let's make space for new voices.
Mhm. Right. And, I think that we could go on and on for all different grade levels and focus and think about how, are we using text to have kids think about these connections and these cares and these concerns? And are we looking at the ways that, we can explore relationships in text and what are the layers of conversation that we can have around gender roles or how cultural race or socioeconomic issues are being portrayed in the text. Is there acceptance, is there tolerance? And also thinking about when we are focusing on giving kids the time to do this work, right? Because they are using their experiences and their perspectives. And so we have to have an opportunity and structures and routines in place for kids to do this kind of talk and thinking and listening to one another.
Yes. Yes. No,
Absolutely.
agree. Everything. Yes, 100%. And I think what you said is listening to each other. And so when kids get to hear from each other, that's when it really makes an impact.
Right. And so I am just thinking as we are focusing on this, we've talked a lot about some of the primary experiences, some of the series books for those middle grade readers. And in a moment, just looking at a lens through like a middle school, which just we're going to do that. One second. So thinking again, like even at the middle school level, and this is from East Side School in New York City, these opportunities to annotate text in a deeper way and to really think critically about moments in stories and looking for these ideas. And so having kids have conversations about like when you see something in a text that is really referencing what's quote unquote, let's say a gender norm, like talking back to the text about that. Like, what did you notice? What are you seeing? And I
Mhm.
think that talking back to the text is so important. I know Ernest Morel talks about how we can have, kids with like author-centered, text-centered, and reader-centered approach. And I think all of those things are interchangeable because we have to think about the way that they are not interchangeable, excuse me, interconnected, just like
Mhm.
intersectionality of, when you're thinking through a character in a text. And so giving kids the opportunity to talk back to a text. And I think it's essential. And I know that we've had this conversation about doing that work
Mhm.
from a picture book to a novel, and obviously colleagues at the upper grade level who've been influenced by my co-book ambassador, Julia Torres, one of the co-founders of
It's
Disrupt
amazing.
Text. Essential work to be done, with the canon and thinking beyond the canon and really going to disrupt all of that for so many of the reasons we've already
Yes.
said.
Yes.
And so if
Yes.
we can start this work at a very young age and continue to do this work, I think it's really essential. We talked a lot about, leaving teachers with some takeaways. And so even with regards to discussion possibilities, whether you're annotating the text or just talking about text, like, especially right now in this world of, Zooms and being aware of, having to have, jam boards or Padlets or breakout rooms. Sometimes the conversations aren't face to face in those, huddled over a book, but those questions are like keys, right? And open-ended
Yeah.
questions are key.
Absolutely. And that's what's really going to guide the conversation and stir the things that you want in your children. It's all about the right question.
Hmm. Absolutely. And, they're like keys. You don't always know what that right question is, and it'll be sparked by the experience of our students, the experience of a character in a book, or the everyday real world issues and experiences that are happening
Mhm.
in our world. And that's why I think it's so essential, to be focused on this open-ended question, because we're guided by not just the text, but life, right? So
Well, and also a nice exercise, especially with older kids. Some of the kids, you can always do it verbally and talk about it. But if the kids are starting to learn how to write, ask them what their version of that book would be. Like, if put yourself in there and then write that book. Like, that's a really cool exercise to do with your children.
And even to think about those characters in a book and how they change the ending or how they
Hmm.
change a particular moment in a story and why, right? Always going
Yes.
back to the why. Super essential. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time, or ask you if you don't mind, to spend a little bit of time going back to, the newer, or I should say the next edition, the next in the series, which I'm so excited. Bravo, Anjali. And you could talk a little bit about that, because it really does help us have this conversation about centering and not othering.
Yes, and that's the thing, so the Anjali series is the only, which is shocking but not surprising, illustrated book series that centers a South Asian hero. I know it sounds insane, like, really, there's nothing, but there really isn't, not in this age group. And so, and again, it's a family. It's a brown family, just living life. And we follow Anjali, who in the first book really kind of figures out who she is and how she wants to own what parts of herself. And in the second book, as we kind of follow along, again, it's about the cultural stuff is folded in, but it's about her figuring out how she wants to own her excellence. And she is in a tabla class, and I always like to throw in things that people might not know about. Some people know tabla, some people don't, but everybody should. And so it's one of those things where, like, she's taking a music class. I've had people say to me, like, there's music classes for tabla. I go, yes, of course there are, just like you would have guitar classes or you would have piano classes. And even when I was working at the Illustrator, I said, make sure not every kid in there is Indian. Let's really show what it could be like. And so there's a lot of Easter eggs like that in all of my books, in the sense of, like, folding in things that I hope to present as a new reality, that we're not needing to, kind of put a big horn on it, but also be like, this is normal again, in her life. And so in this book, she is the best in her class. She's also the only girl. And it was very much about me kind of upending the gender norms, because tabla is a predominantly male dominated instrument. And I thought, I wonder what it'd be like if Anjali was the best at it, and what that would feel like in her world. And so we really follow her, having to decide if she's going to let people make her feel bad about being good at something, and really having conversations with our kids about what that is, that kind of jealousy, that kind of, there's added layers to it, I think, which some people will get and some won't, because she's a girl and it comes from one of her friends that's a boy. But overall, it's about figuring out, and teaching our kids that, like, they need to own and step into their light and take up their space. And so that's what this book is about. And again, I don't see in a lot of books, this conversation of this kind of gender kind of bias that we have, and also what to do when there's all these microaggressions that kids don't even realize they're doing. They don't even know it. And so when I got to the end of the book, it's interesting. I had a version of it. My editor made a good point. She said, let's not let Deepak off the hook too much. Deepak is her friend. Let's not let him off the hook. Let her, like, have it that he has to own what he did to her, And so there's a conversation at the end that I'm very proud of. It's all very kid centered, kid language, but So that then that's the takeaway for teachers to talk about. You know, there's little like nuggets in there that would then allow for conversations, I think, um, to have, because I think there's a lot of things that our kids are feeling that they can't put a name to. And I hope this book will allow for these kind of conversations because it's happening.
I know I was privileged to get an opportunity to read that book, and I haven't even seen it with all of the illustrations. I just read the text, and
Beautiful.
I was so moved by that, and I love the fact that that message in there, that powerful message to own your light and to be
Hmm.
have kids feel that. But I do think that the opportunity for kids to think about the conscience, the signals of your mind and your heart, and that struggle, and being able to recognize sometimes we have friends who don't do things like again, we can have microaggressions on so many different levels, but thinking about even in the frenemy piece, like how
Yes.
that's
Yes.
a real struggle for kids
Yes.
to deal with, and they in that young age where how do we handle this when someone doesn't treat us the way that we want to be treated, and what do we
Yeah,
do?
and it's funny you say that because I just had that conversation with my oldest daughter because a friend did something to her, and she's like, and she started just saying that she's bad and I don't want to be her friend. And I said, she's not bad. She just wasn't being a good friend to you in that moment. Just it's not one thing that makes somebody, and there's no bad kid, but it's
Right.
interesting how like, well, how they associate things. And I was really trying to get her to think like she did one thing that wasn't thoughtful, but this is what we can do about that. And that's what friends do, by the way. A good friend would say that you hurt my feelings or whatever it may be, and have a conversation that needs to be had. It's on both people. And so I think you're right. I think there's a lot of that, that there's not enough talked about, in terms of in the classroom socially, the social learning, the emotional
Well,
social aspect of all of this is big.
right. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just going to say that, like, it's too often in schools, like you hear the SEL is like the buzz about social
Hmm.
emotional learning, but it has to go beyond surface level. And so,
Yes.
when I hear schools are like, well, we have this book and we read this book and you know, um, it was the book of the month, and and it was like we read it and everybody read it and we moved on. Like that's not checking off the box
Right.
like you have social emotional learning. It's like getting into these deep conversations and looking really at those core competencies, and
Hmm.
what are the layers even within those core competencies about
Yes.
self-awareness and self-management and relationships, and then how does equity and inequities play out into all of that when we're looking at stories, and who has the power, who has the privilege, or in the Anjali case, the whole gender role in there and how she
Yes.
was uncomfortable. She didn't want to step up because she thought that she would then make someone else feel uncomfortable, and so that whole
Hmm.
opportunity to really talk about social emotional learning and growth, and recognizing what we can do, so kids can understand emotions and have problem solving and decision making, and to really unpack the
Yes.
text of a story into the lives of their own. I think that's deep social emotional work that ties into this whole idea of your mind and your heart and your conscience, and being critically conscious and aware of what's going on.
Agreed. Yes. 100%.
Well, I thank you for your wonderful book that helps us do this, and I'm so appreciative
Can't
to
wait for you to see it.
authors.
It's so beautiful. I mean, I'm stunned. This illustrator did such a great job, and it gives me goosebumps when I look at that. And I even told our publisher, I go, there are so many pages of this that need to be posters, and we need to just send them to all the schools because they're just gonna like just give you goosebumps.
All right, you heard it here, folks. We're going to get posters for all the schools. No, I love it. I think, if we have the opportunity to have messages through books, and I think then can
Yes.
continue to go, it's not just about that book. It's then how does that carry out that message? How does that affect or perhaps get connected into our conversations around our days and what's happening over time, and maybe even to reflect back, remember that in that story. That's really truly connecting the conversations in text to impact real lives, and I think that's huge. That's the life lesson piece that's so important. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time also talking about, if you want to know more about this idea of celebrating stories, and there's a beautiful article that Kelly G. Baptist and Darnell Johnson wrote for Lee and Low about Black joy in children's books, and I think it's just something that really will resonate with you in this conversation about centering joy and centering stories and family lives. And we have to also think about informational text and nonfiction. And so another article to think about is, Debbie Reese talked about how, when we're doing this work, we have to look closely and critically at nonfiction text as well. And I'm super excited about the fact that there's going to be a book out in the summer with with reading and teaching with diverse nonfiction children's books, representation and possibilities. And of course, we're going to say, Sheetal and I are going to say we want to be using an inclusive collection of text.
Yes.
But we get it. And thinking about that, I think that whole idea of representation and possibilities is such a beautiful way of of saying this is what this work is about. And so as we're leaving you thinking about not just Anjali and not just the text we've shared, but thinking beyond books to do this work, I think that's really important. So again, just a few ideas, if we're using text, whether it's fiction or informational text, how might we use text to inspire students to be agents of change? Because perhaps there was an aspect of a story or an experience that, will influence the way that they're thinking. So here we have, young students looking at powerful, influential women in history. And I love that they have her story there.
Right.
And then we have a middle school example of kids looking at sexism and gender roles and problematic issues with women in business and how people should be viewed. And I think even going back to some elementary students thinking about what is it that you stand for and what is it that you want to see happen. And this couldn't be more real that we're living in COVID times in classrooms and friends in Northern Park where kids they went on and did a walk, a protest through the school with their signs.
Amazing.
One individually, what they felt strongly about. And that happens when we have powerful books and conversations.
So I just did last week a virtual visit with a pre-K class. And so my questions are geared toward a pre-K class. And I asked them, I said, does anyone here know what an author does? And in unison, they go, they change the world. And I was like, oh my gosh, I love this teacher. Like that again is taught. It's how amazing for these literally 3 and 4-year-olds to say that. I was stunned and so just blown away.
That's wonderful. I love that pre-K students are saying.
I couldn't believe it. I've never heard that before. And I wrote to the teacher after. I said, you are obviously like A plus, gold star to you. You're obviously doing amazing work with these kids.
And I think what's equally as important is that kids view themselves as having the power to use their voice and their art and their words and their actions to change the world. I think that's such a beautiful message. And I think that's when really great things happen, connecting this idea of community and character and content. And so that brings me to another thought with regards to, giving kids the opportunity to see how not only authors change the world, but how they themselves can change the world. And so, I am really excited about the opportunity to interview people like Sheetal, and Going Behind the Book is a series that we started, and you can see the QR codes to go back there. I started that with Stenhouse, where we're able to interview authors and bring authors like Sheetal into the classroom to have some of these conversations. And I think that whether or not you have a live Ed Collab gathering or an interview, there are ways to go about this, to dig a little deeper, to find the websites with the interviews, to find the articles or the blog posts or the interviews. And you've given us so many opportunities through, your own experience with both books. And I think we can continue to look forward to that, because you have to get the story from the
and there's always yes, that, and there's always resources. Like all of my books have free downloadable teacher parent guides. Most books do. Like most of the authors I know make a point to have all of this stuff accessible, free, online. So just get it, and then the work is right there. We want to make this as easy as possible for you.
Right. So when you're thinking about curating not only collections, but curating resources to support the conversation. So perhaps it may be a TED Talk that would be really powerful to share with your kids, or perhaps it's an art project. And I think that idea of layering in those connections is so, so powerful. And look, if we sit together in a group and we reflect on this work and we say, okay, I'll do this, I'll search for, what that book has led me to. Now I saw this from Sheetal, I want to go find another article that she referenced, and so like, if we can all take some of that work, many hands make light work, and then we curate the collections, and this becomes even more powerful.
Yes.
Which is wonderful. So on that note, we want to share a few more ideas with you about things that you can do and leave you with some of those ideas, thinking about how Today, we talked a lot about, affirming voices and affirming, oops, let me go back there, affirming voices and identities and amplifying voices, and really looking closely, examining own voice work that centers children finding joy or encountering new perspectives, and then having the conversations to give kids the opportunity. When you're looking for books, are you looking at books that are going to expand perspective and point of view so that they can invite these conversations and promote critical thinking? And we have some additional resources in terms of professional books, some great places. First Book has a variety of resources to look at and recognize bias in text, some great teacher resources, Basic History in Ourselves, Learning for Justice, some professional books that we've mentioned throughout, and we've referenced some resources from in the presentation. And then if you don't know, and I don't know many teachers who are watching this who wouldn't know the social justice standards and anti-bias framework, this is essential to add to this conversation. And so we hope we're leaving you with some of those ideas as well. And Sheetal, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and being available and making yourself not only the co-teacher on the page, but off the page. So thank you, thank you.
No, it's my pleasure. And, and I'm not an expert. It's just, I come at it as somebody, as you said, a lifelong learner who very much cares about this work. I do it in all of my jobs. I have a lot of jobs. I'm also a mom. I have a minor in education. I love teachers. I think the world of all of you. And so I just feel like if we all, like you said, light hands make, the work easier. Like, let's just all, we can do this. It's just, we all just have to share and have the uncomfortable conversations. It's okay. Let's just talk about it.
And better together. Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. So if you want to find out more from Sheetal or check out any of her additional fabulous resources, we put some links to some articles she's written, and then you can visit Sheetal at her website or follow her on Twitter, or you can email if you have questions, and I can certainly get them back to Sheetal, and email or tweet and share your thinking with us. Thank you for spending the time, but share your thinking because we're continuing to learn and to grow, and we learn together. So
yes, and I would love to hear your feedback, and feel free to reach out. There is an email address on my website. You can reach out, and we could talk about doing, I've done a lot of kind of sessions, not just with kids, but with parents too. Like sometimes the community be like, can we just have an open conversation with the parent community? I go, yes, we can do that. And that all of those things push the needle forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That would have been another whole workshop just to talk about family. Next time.
Yes, next time.
You so much.
Thank you so much.
Be well, everyone. Happy learning. Thanks for joining us at the Ed Collab gathering. We look forward to seeing you at the next one.